Hello and good morning. In the last class, when we had met last, we had been talking about largely the Indo-Pacific. And in the Indo-Pacific, we had developed an understanding. Is the mic working? Am I audible? Kam aa rahi hai? Now? Okay. So in the last class, what we were doing was, we were talking about the larger geostrategic region of the Indo-Pacific. And in that, we had developed a very simple understanding that for India, the region is a simple geography that combines the Indian Ocean and Pacific Ocean. And then we had developed an understanding that the discussions on this region are happening in a particular context, when there is generally a shift of power and influence from west to east in terms of the location of countries, in terms of various strategic engagements that exist here. Secondly, it is happening in the context of an increasing importance of the maritime domain. When global trade has increased, what we see is oceans have become important. And then thirdly, it is happening in the context of rise of such countries which have displayed an ability to define their interests beyond their region and also have the intentions to develop capabilities to defend these interests, meaning there are multiple countries which now are interested in the regions beyond where they are particularly located. For example, India is interested in the Pacific, China is interested in the Indian Ocean region, and then there is United States or Japan or Australia. These countries have these kinds of interests. So then we also understood that when India says Indo-Pacific, it means a region which is for cooperation, which is a region where there is respect for certain principles, and these principles are freedom of navigation, freedom of overflight, lawful unimpeded commerce. And then what we see is India also says that Indo-Pacific should remain free, open, inclusive, and a rules-based region. So India argues for a rules-based order in the Indo-Pacific. That is something I hope you will remember. So then we looked at India's relations with Southeast Asia. Indo-Pacific के बारे में बात की थी हमने. Do you recall any of these things that I currently mentioned? Okay. So then we moved to Southeast Asia. We said that relations with Southeast Asia can be defined in terms of culture, commerce, and connectivity. Meaning India has trade engagements, India has cultural engagements, and India's political and diplomatic engagements are increasing. And we looked at certain important aspects of this relationship. For example, free trade agreement in both goods and services. So that has led to expansion of trade from look east to act east, but also a deficit which has grown. And then we had moved forward to looking at the RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is a free trade agreement right now between ASEAN and 5 of its free trade partners. Who are these 5 free trade partners of ASEAN? 6 in terms of negotiations. When negotiations started, it was 6 countries, precisely because India did not sign the agreement. 5 now. All right. So these are Australia, China, Japan, South Korea, and New Zealand. Now these are the participants apart from the 10 countries of ASEAN in the RCEP. That is what we had talked about in the last class. So we said that why did India first participate in the negotiations? If you will remember, 2012 the negotiations started and 2019 the negotiations ended. India was throughout the negotiations a party to the process. But eventually India decided not to sign the agreement. So first thing is, why did India engage in this agreement when it did not have to sign it? So these things are not decided a priori. It has a particular basis, meaning India decided to join the RCEP simply because it was a trade agreement led by ASEAN. So we have strategic relations with ASEAN, so we wanted to continue with that strategic relations. B, it would have provided us an opportunity to be on the table when a large trade agreement involving some of our most important partners is being negotiated. So thereby we could have addressed issues where we have problems. For example, trade deficit could be addressed here in the long term, in the longest term. And also we could have ensured some of our interests. For example, we could have ensured progress in services or certain specific access in terms of pharmaceuticals and textiles. So that is why India participated, meaning India first and foremost participated because it thought that this agreement would serve its interests. And then India participated in the context of the significance of RCEP. So RCEP proposed to be at that point in time the largest free trade agreement in terms of number of countries which are part of it. Number of countries, but more necessarily the size of these economies. So today RCEP is world's largest free trade agreement in terms of the size of economies which are part of it. So thereby we were negotiating an agreement which included countries with around 30% of global GDP, right? Around 30% of global population, important trading countries. So this was again an important way of remaining relevant in the Indo-Pacific, in the economic future of the Indo-Pacific. And thirdly, we can say certain principles. So in general, just understand that India believes that it benefits from multilateral system of trading which is rules based, meaning it benefits from a globalized trading order because we are latecomers to globalization. We are not a developed country, we are a developing country, and we see after 1991 our trade, our economy, the size of our GDP has increased. So thereby India would be interested in taking forward any attempt to further liberalize the trade order to create a level playing field. So RCEP represented at that point in time an important effort in this direction because A, there were logjams or difficulties at WTO. Around 2018-19, China and United States were engaged in what is called trade wars, increasing tariffs on each other. But WTO stands for certain principles, right? That there should be no discrimination. If there are any complaints, it should be addressed in a systematic manner. So WTO was being undermined, new issues were not being discussed, there was disagreement on that, progress was not being made. Second is, in this context, most of the countries then moved towards either having their own regional trade agreements or bilateral trade agreements. And thirdly, we see that there was a large trade agreement in the Indo-Pacific at that point in time, 2011 till 2018. The US led what is called the Trans-Pacific Partnership, right? US was leading another trade agreement of which India was not a part. Trans-Pacific Partnership that now is called Comprehensive Trans-Pacific Partnership, all right? Comprehensive and Progressive, CPTPP. Trans-Pacific Partnership, in which US is not a part, but 11 countries of the Indo-Pacific, larger Indo-Pacific are a part, right? So then when TPP negotiations also stopped, there were problems at WTO. RCEP represented a hope for continuing with global trade liberalization or moving towards a trading order which is rules based. And remember, in simple terms, India benefits from a rules-based trading order. That is what we believe, that the trading order should be based on rules, right? Rather than having to engage with countries without rules, we prefer rules. So that is why India participated in the negotiations. All right, yahan tak hum pahunch gaye the in the last class. Anyone? All of you have slept. Do you remember that we had reached till this point? And then we said that we will continue in the next class. What? In the next class we will continue the RCEP, and then we will move further in the Indo-Pacific region, right? So then let's try and use our brains to answer a few questions after having looked at these things. Or if you have any difficulty in anything, then you can also raise a question if you want to. If you want to be active, you can raise a question. If not, then you can answer these questions. All right, what questions? Let's see. The questions that UPSC has asked. UPSC has asked a lot of questions from this direction, right? C, very good, C. So these are the questions that UPSC asks. Matching between people, ethnic communities and the countries that they come from. Kurds are found in West Asia. All right, Turkey, Iran, Syria. These are the countries, and Iraq, northern part of Iraq. This is where you will find Kurds. But you know that Madhesis we have talked in the context of Nepal, and Rohingyas are from Myanmar, right? So this is a general question from what we have done so far. Since we are meeting after so many days, this is a question that now starts moving towards Indian Ocean. All right? Which of the following pairs of islands is separated from? Right, A. Very good. I know that all of you are intelligent. So just remember what UPSC expects out of you. Then this is another question which is about the region that we have been talking about. Which of the following is closest to Great Nicobar? Sumatra, of course. Very good. Moving forward. Now this particular question. Perhaps I had mentioned this question also while showing you the map. Now apply your mind. It would not be, these kind of questions would ask you to exercise patience. All right. What is the correct sequence of occurrence of the following cities in Southeast Asia as one proceeds from south to north? C. C is 3, 4, 1, 2. Meaning you are saying first Jakarta, then Singapore, then Bangkok, and then Hanoi. So we know that in Southeast Asia, the northernmost capital in terms of its latitudinal location would be Hanoi, and the southernmost would be Jakarta. All right. So can anyone answer which countries of South Asia the equator passes through? आपने ये देखा होगा क्वेश्चन, ही तो आसान है. Now give me another related answer. Which countries of Southeast Asia? Any other country? Papua New Guinea. Pakka? Papua New Guinea is a guess that you are making. Indonesia. All right, generally we don't count Papua New Guinea as a country of Southeast Asia. Equator does not pass through Papua New Guinea. All right, so Indonesia is one country. Which islands? If UPSC wants to make it further difficult. Huh? Borneo. That's it. Not Java. Right. I'm only giving you a sense. When we look at the map, what do we try to remember? Now this question. India is a member of which of the following? Three statements. APEC, Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation, I have mentioned it. Association of Southeast Asian Nations, which is ASEAN. And third is East Asia Summit. What is the answer? What is the answer? Exercise your brain. These are not very difficult questions. These are awareness-based questions. A, 1 and 2 only, which is Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation and Association of Southeast Asian Nations. This is the wrongest possible answer. All right. B, East Asia Summit. India is not a member of ASEAN. ASEAN includes which countries? 10 countries of Southeast Asia. So how can you, even looking at the option, how can you make that determination? Whichever option has 2 is not the correct option. So meaning, by that simple information, you eliminate and make it correct. But neither did you know directly, nor did you try and look at the options. Right? India is only participating in East Asia Summit, which is a strategic dialogue, leaders-led dialogue between 10 countries of Southeast Asia and 8 of its partners, including India. All right. APEC, Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation, was established in 1989. It has 21 members and India is not one of them. Its secretariat is in Singapore. It aims to promote trade liberalization among the participating 21 countries. I had mentioned it and I remember it. And then Association of Southeast Asian Nations is a no-brainer, right? So sometimes try to answer the question by straight what you know, but also look at the options. Options also are there to help you, right? It's not an ego examination. So it's only a personal vanity project in terms of you wanting to become IAS, IFS, IPS, whatever you want to become. But then the examination is not looking at the most intelligent people. It is looking at people who understand the logic of it. It is not testing your capability in terms of how much you can remember, but how can you apply your brain to answer questions. directly or indirectly. This year UPSC had made it further interesting. This question. D. D is 1 to 5. Mekong Ganga cooperation or Mekong Ganga cooperation, 6 countries are members. UPSC is also telling you, informing you that 6 countries are members. Now you simply have to tell which countries are not members of Mekong Ganga. C. Perhaps I have not talked about it. So the simple idea is that the Mekong Ganga initiative is another initiative, small, lesser talked about, which was formed in the year 2000. Its members are CLMV plus IT. Meaning, what are the CLMV countries? From Southeast Asia. Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, Vietnam, plus India and Thailand. These are the members of Mekong Ganga initiative, if you would recall. But remember, I had told you, I had shown you on the map the flow of the Mekong River. Do you remember? I had shown you the map of Southeast Asia. And I asked you to look at the rivers. Alright? Why are you so silent today? Why is it not clicking? These are simple questions, right? CLMV countries plus IT, 2000 it was formed. And its primary purpose is to promote cooperation in areas like tourism, culture, education, transport and communication. Transport and communication. All right, transport and communication. That is what it involves. Promoting cooperation between the countries of Mekong and Ganga basin, two civilizational rivers, across the areas of tourism, culture, education, transport and communication. India is one of the members of Mekong Ganga initiative. Thereby you would be able to answer this question. All right. The question's answer is very simple. China and Bangladesh. From this list, China and Bangladesh, 1 and 3, are not the members. All right. Answer C. And we'll remember also, China is a country through which the Mekong flows. Mekong originates in China, but it is not a member of an organization called Mekong Ganga Initiative. Bangladesh is a country through which the Ganges flows, the Ganga flows, but it is not a member of Mekong Ganga Initiative. The idea is very simple, to show you the questions and to tell you that these are awareness based questions, right? So keep your approach very simple. And apart from writing, pay attention to awareness also, observation also. This question, we were talking about RCEP. UPSC has asked questions on RCEP, but what kinds of questions? So UPSC does not want you to be trade experts, international trade experts. It wants you to be aware. If you are reading newspaper, you will know. What is the answer to this question? Easy? B, easy question. So UPSC also asks easy questions. Those who mark the easy questions incorrectly would be eliminated first, right? So now this, UPSC has made a question which now would ask you to apply your mind. But this is also an easy question. Which of the above are among the free trade partners of ASEAN? Option B, meaning which one of them are not? Canada and USA. All right, 2 and 6. Canada and USA are not the members, right? So thereby, simple elimination. And why this question? Should we remember, for example, it comes to our mind that we should remember everything. But should we remember everything? In that particular year, RCEP was in a crucial stage of negotiation. So it was regularly being covered by the newspaper. So if you are simply reading newspaper, you realize that RCEP is nothing but a free trade negotiation between ASEAN and its trade partners, free trade partners. So that meant that you necessarily don't need to know who are the free trade partners of ASEAN, but you should know who are participating in RCEP. And why is that important? Because India was participating in the RCEP negotiations, right? So even if you take care of India's interests, no matter what is happening in the world, the examination becomes easier, right? So then 1, 3, 4 and 5, right? These are the free trade partners of ASEAN, and China, USA and Canada are not, right? Simply indirect way of asking this question. If you literally take it, then you would start thinking, I don't know exactly whether Canada and USA are trade partners of ASEAN or not. But either you look at the option, then you look at the option. Option tells you. Or you have been reading the newspaper, so you know what RCEP is. RCEP is a trade agreement between ASEAN and its free trade partners. Right? हो गया? UPSC ऐसे क्वेश्चन पूछती है. Then UPSC asked this question in 2021. We will go there, but would you be able to answer this question? Would you be able to answer this question? I always try and tell you that in IR we try to correlate things. For example, this year UPSC for the first time asked a question on climate change, clean energy, and India's position on that. Primarily you study that in either current affairs, so you were aware of COP26 and India's position there, or you were aware of whatever you studied in environment and ecology, right? So it's a combination question. Can you answer this question? Have you heard of these? Have you heard of the Annex 1 countries? Where would you find Annex 1 countries? In what context Annex 1 countries you may have heard? Where do you find certified emission reductions? And where do you find clean development mechanism? एक तो पता होगा, anyone? Clean development mechanism? Vishal asks Mekong Ganga countries. Mekong Ganga countries, Mekong Ganga initiative. Who are the members? Tell me. CLMV, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, Vietnam, and India and Thailand. Right? Now answer this question. पढ़ा होगा ना आपने? Environment नहीं हुआ अभी? हो गया है? 2 क्लासेस हुई. लेकिन जनरली न्यूज़पेपर पढ़ते समय या जनरली ऐसे ही पढ़ते समय ये सारी चीज़ें आ जाती हैं. मैं सिंपली बता देता हूँ, ये तीनों चीज़ें Kyoto Protocol में है. All right, all these 3 things are in Kyoto Protocol, not in Cartagena Protocol, not in Nagoya Protocol. All right. So if you are studying, for example, let's say environment and ecology, you may have a chronological approach as well. Right? There is a conceptual approach. So all of you would like to become experts of all the subjects that you study, but there are certain commonsensical ways. Right? So we have, for example, formation of the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Right? Then after that, UN. Right? And then along with this, you have certain conventions which come up. Convention on biodiversity, convention on desertification. Right? And then in this negotiation, UNFCCC meets now through conference of parties, right? That's why COP26, that's why COP this, COP that. So within that, Kyoto was where the meeting took place and certain important decisions were taken. So I'm not going deeply here, you will study it. So there is a chronological approach. So you realize that Kyoto Protocol is known for Annex 1 countries, right? Generally associated with UNFCCC, Annex 1 countries, meaning countries which took binding commitment to reduce carbon emissions. All right. B, then the Nagoya Protocol and Cartagena protocols are protocols to Convention on Biodiversity. Right. So even if you know a few things, so in any case, in this CDM and Kyoto Protocol are the only correctly matched ones. Right. Chaliye. Now let's move forward and go back and do your favorite task, which is writing. All right, where you will feel comfortable. अभी एग्जाम बहुत दूर है, लेकिन still you have not developed a way of thinking about the examination. Right? Try and do that. Don't try and think that remembering things is the only requirement. Right? So then India signed the RCEP. India negotiated the RCEP, and India did not participate in the RCEP. All right, we have all warmed up. So then the next question would be, why did India not sign the RCEP? All right, why did India not sign the RCEP? So what are the reasons? The reasons are to do with India's own perception of its interests and the nature of the RCEP as it finally emerged. So for example, yesterday was Gandhi Jayanti. So the Prime Minister in 2019 said, neither Gandhiji's talisman nor my conscience allows me to sign the RCEP. All right? In simple terms, that it would not benefit India. That's India's understanding, right? That it would not benefit the poorest in India. So these are some fancy language which you will find in international relations, right? But then there is a simple meaning of it. So that is what India said, neither Gandhiji's talisman nor my conscience allows me to sign the RCEP. Then we understand that this may mean a few things. One, that the RCEP in its final form, does not represent the original spirit of negotiations, and it does not address India's concerns. All right? So then, neither Gandhiji's talisman nor my conscience reads to, first, the final agreement does not reflect the spirit in which the negotiations took place. Meaning, we thought that the negotiations would be an opportunity where the views of each country's, the idea of equitable or idea of equity would be addressed, would be taken care of. It did not happen, and thereby finally, logically, it does not address India's concerns, right? So there is always a give and take involved, but we are not happy with the give and take involved in RCEP. This is the meaning, right? And then it may mean certain specific things. What specific things? So when we were negotiating, it was clear that while there were high demands for reduction of tariffs in goods, reduction of tariff in goods, meaning the trade agreement expected that India would eventually open up more than 90% of goods that it trades for tariff reduction, right? To 0%. Meaning India would open its market by 90% in goods. And if we include demands on agriculture, it even crosses 90%. Every country would like to safeguard some sectors of its economy, right? So India faced pressure for reducing tariffs in the category of goods, and then there was a trade-off that we expect, that maybe we will benefit in terms of services. So we find that while high demand on tariff, lack of concessions on services, meaning there was not so much of an enthusiasm in terms of opening of market in services, and that is generally the problem in global trade negotiations. When we say trade has liberalized or globalized, we see that the movement of goods and capital, investments, goods, exports, imports have increased, but simultaneously the ease of movement of professionals, workers, laborers has not been satisfactory, right? That is something that for India is a concern. Why is it a concern for India? Simply because India is a labor surplus country. If you know anything about your country, you know this, that we are almost number one in population. And that means that we, with a younger population, we have a pressure for producing adequate employment, right? And when we see the reality that domestically it's not always possible. So then for India, the whole world is a services market in terms of movement of professionals. That's why you will see Indians moving in large number to US, Indian moving in large number to Gulf countries, right? And generally this would remain the trend. So thereby what India wants is in its trade agreements, or generally it would like in the area of global trade, that services is where greater liberalization is required. And specifically in what mode of services? Movement of professionals, movement of workers. So we found that there were not adequate concessions on services, meaning there was no concomitant enthusiasm on services, right? And then gradually this means that these two things were also discussed domestically. So we found that in 2019 there was significant domestic opposition from sectors like from manufacturing sector, and also from labor unions. Meaning domestically, the way RCEP progressed, important stakeholders in economy started opposing RCEP. Manufacturers were afraid that they would face undue competition from whom? From cheap manufacturing coming from China. And specifically when we are thinking about Make in India, it would be detrimental for that. For example, the MSME sector may be wiped out because of cheaper imports from other countries, right? And then, and labor unions were dissatisfied because the RCEP involved negotiations on reforms in labor laws. All right, so investments would have come, but it would not have generated the jobs that we expect. And then we see that when India expected some mechanisms to deal with these difficulties, they were not present. Lack of a satisfactory safeguard mechanism against import surge, So that is also there, that suppose if import from any one particular economy increases beyond an acceptable level, then we want that there should be an auto trigger mechanism, that there should be a provision that now duties can increase. India has the right to increase the duties when imports cross a particular threshold. So this safeguards our domestic market. So these kinds of safeguard mechanisms were also not satisfactory in the final draft for India. So we say the lack of satisfactory safeguard mechanism against import surge. For example, free trade agreement. Without free trade agreement, China is exporting a lot to India. We had seen that data. Now with free trade agreement, that would increase further. So if we think that that is detrimental to our manufacturing sector, then the safeguard mechanism allows us to put duties beyond a particular level of imports and thereby safeguard our own domestic manufacturers. So these were absent or not satisfactory in the RCEP. And then concerns of trade deficit. All related points. So when India was negotiating RCEP, it had trade deficit with 11 of the other participants, right? 11 of the other 15 participants, India had a trade deficit at that point in time, without free trade agreement with many. So now when we open up our market, another chance is that our trade deficit would increase. So that was a concern that is always there. We always think of trade deficit or balance of trade. Specifically now, when right now, if you have noticed, if you have been reading newspaper, we see that there is volatility in terms of price of rupee. So RBI is intervening. RBI is intervening to shore up the price of the rupee against the dollar, and that means that our foreign exchange reserves are going down, right? And trade deficit is the surest way of affecting these fundamentals. So concerns of increasing trade deficit, because we already had trade deficit with 11 of these countries which were negotiating at that point in time the RCEP. And then we also have difficulties in terms of investment liberalization could have given China a foothold in India or in India's economy. Meaning RCEP also involved provisions on investments liberalization. So right now we have a policy space in which we can defend certain sectors from investments from China. For example, in telecommunications, we have launched the 5G. 5G services are launched. So we have concerns regarding the involvement of Chinese companies in areas like telecommunications. Or we are in the process of opening up defense for foreign investments. So even in those kinds of areas, we would like to safeguard against Chinese investments. And remember, by the time India decided not to sign the RCEP, tensions between India and China were increasing. So now we see 2020, the Galwan clashes made it clear that not signing the RCEP has also got strategic connotation, strategic significance. So then that is something that we wanted to avoid. And if you understand concerns on trade deficit, that is also a China specific point. If you see import surges, that is also a China specific point. These are major concerns vis-a-vis China. Otherwise, we already have a free trade agreement with ASEAN. We have a free trade agreement with Japan. We have a free trade agreement with South Korea, not Australia right now. So thereby we move to concerns in the agriculture sector, agriculture and dairy sector. So one of the sectors which opposed RCEP was the agriculture and the dairy sector with regard to Australia and New Zealand, meaning at that point in time, what were we talking about? We were talking about doubling farm income. That was the mantra at that point in time. So how do you double farm income? By either increasing the efficiency of the agricultural sector or by promoting the allied sectors, right? Like the dairy or animal husbandry sector. So then if we allow cheaper imports of agricultural commodities from Australia and dairy commodities from Australia and New Zealand, it would be detrimental for our farmers. Why? Because Australia and New Zealand together are the largest exporters of dairy products. And Australia is among the largest exporters of agricultural commodities, right? So opening up our market in this area would have been detrimental for agricultural and dairy sector, right? That was very clear. And at that point in time, whether you recall it or not, there was a sudden decrease in milk prices, right? So there was a concern that this would be the trend if we open up our market for Australia and New Zealand. And this is one of the sticking points in India-Australia free trade negotiations as well. Then lack of stringent rules of origin provision, meaning India wanted stricter criteria for determining rules of origin, and rules of origin are important in terms of imposition of tariffs on goods. Where is the good originating from? That is something which is important in terms of determining the tariffs on goods. Here, how is it significant? So first of all, we know that China takes advantage of its cheap manufacturing, and its policies are at times like dumping in others' markets. All right, dumping is a word that is your favorite, it seems. So then we also understand that not only this, China also routes some of its exports through other countries. For example, Hong Kong is considered to be a separate trading entity in India's external trade, right? So we see that from Hong Kong, China's products are coming. We also see that China exports to other Southeast Asian countries, and from there also Chinese exports are coming, right? So then this makes it important to determine where is the origin of the product so that we can adequately put tariffs on that. And how is it relevant here? Because see, there are certain countries which are least developed countries. I hope you will remember that we talked about least developed countries when we were talking about Bangladesh. All right, and least developed countries generally are given some flexibility and some concessional treatment in these kinds of trade agreements. All right, for example, a longer duration for implementation of the agreement. For example, further concessional tariff rates. So this is common trade practice. So then what prevents China, let's say, from exporting to Vietnam when 90% of the production has taken place, value addition has taken place in China, 10% in Vietnam, and then that product is exported to, let's say, India's market as a product of Vietnam, right? So suppose if we are providing concessional treatment to Vietnam, countries like China may take advantage of it, right? 90% of the manufacturing, let's say, of a smartphone takes place in China, it is exported and then finally only assembled in Vietnam, and then it is exported as a product of Vietnam, right? So then in those cases, who is the major beneficiary, China or Vietnam? So that is something that our concern is, and that is why we wanted to have stringent rules of origin, meaning clear rules for determining what would be the rule of what would be the origin of a particular product to safeguard our markets. And this was not present in the RCEP, right? So that's why if you have been reading current affairs, the trade agreement with UAE which we signed is important because it has very clear provisions for rule of origin. 40% of value addition must have taken place in UAE for it to be considered to be a product of UAE. So these kinds of rules of rules of origin that we wanted. So again, this was lacking when it came to the RCEP. And then there were concerns on IPR provisions which were being negotiated in the context of sectors like generic pharma. So most of these modern free trade agreements these days are trying to go beyond the requirement of TRIPS. India says we are TRIPS compliant and we would not like to go beyond TRIPS. This is called TRIPS plus. Developed countries would like stringent provisions going beyond the flexibility of TRIPS. So this flexibility of TRIPS has enabled India to develop a significant generic pharmaceutical sector. That's why India is called the pharmacy of the world. And if we start accepting provisions which go beyond the TRIPS flexibility, then it would curtail our ability to sustain the generic pharmaceutical sector. So these were also the concerns in the context of the RCEP, that it would eventually not be to India's interest, detrimental to manufacturing sector, detrimental to the labor sector, detrimental in the context of IPR, detrimental to the agricultural and dairy sector, and then also larger concerns regarding China, meaning it would have provided China a front door entry into India's market, front and back door entry into India's market, right? China is in the greatest position to advantage from RCEP. So that's why we understand that India decided not to sign the RCEP, that we will not sign the RCEP. We did not state these reasons, but these reasons generally are understood in the context of India's trade interests. All right, India's trade interests. So we said, sorry, we are not signing. And then the question is, can we criticize India's decision? What are the concerns regarding India's decision? So at that point in time, if you are reading newspaper, and this would be relevant even now, generally the concerns are regarding India's image or opportunities that India would lose. All right, domestic opportunities and external opportunities. So major criticisms were that it signals protectionism, on India's part, that India still is more or less a protectionist country. So it is not willing to liberalize much. So it would send a wrong signal to investors, to the global economic community, that India is not willing to open up. And that is something that we have been debating since the 1990s, since we opened our markets. All right. So that is something that people said. Not signing the RCEP is, in a way, a protectionist stance, right? Secondly, India would lose out, or let's say it would mean losing out on the opportunity, of regional trade integration. This is a process which is going on, and integration with regional value chains, right? So this is simple, that in South Asia there is lack of regional integration. We see an opportunity in the context of Southeast Asia because we are a free trade partners with them. Manufacturing may be shifting away from China, may be coming towards Southeast Asia countries like Vietnam. So it is important for India to integrate itself with regional value chains in this region, in the region of larger Indo-Pacific, in the region of Southeast Asia. So by not participating in the RCEP, India is missing out on the opportunity of integrating itself with the process of regional trade integration in Southeast Asia, which is an important trading partner for us. And we are then losing out on the opportunity of integrating ourselves with the regional value chain, which generally is a prescription for advancing our own manufacturing, right? That we cannot develop adequate capabilities in isolation. All right, we need to take advantage of the global trends. We need to learn. And then this also means letting go of the opportunity for reforms. This is also the meaning. Why and how do reforms take place? Either there should be an internal appetite, meaning you may be facing a crisis and then only you reform. Otherwise you would not reform, you will not change, you would like to go as you are going. So if you see India, when India went for liberalization, privatization, globalization, another favorite words or favorite set of words, one reason was that there was an internal crisis. We could not have gone along the way we were going at that point in time. So policy required changes. Second impetus for reforms comes from external situation. External situation can be negative. So at that point in time, India faced external situation wherein we lost one of our major economic partners in USSR. We had a world which was increasingly uncertain. So suddenly there was a spike in oil prices at that point in time, right? The Gulf crisis. The Americans invaded Iraq. Iraq had invaded Kuwait. So in that particular region, the oil prices increased, and that was the external reason. And then we went for help to IMF. So when we went for help to IMF, IMF said that you have to make reforms, right? So this is why reforms take place, internal reasons or external reasons. So the argument here is that if we sign these kinds of agreements, it allows us to take certain difficult decisions. Otherwise, these decisions would not be taken. Meaning, signing these agreements becomes an opportunity to bring about domestic changes in the context of these agreements. By citing, for example, how would these reforms be justified? That look, the world expects this from us. This is what we need to do. So that's the argument, right? It's an inverse argument. It says, it means simply that when we sign RCEP, agreements like RCEP demand something. And when we try to step up to these demands, what we do is we strengthen ourselves. All right. When we compete, we strengthen ourselves. One formula is protect, grow, and then compete. Another formula is compete and grow. Right. So that is what we mean by this. That we may have lost on the opportunity of initiating much needed domestic reform. Now these are the points that are always debated. These are points which would be helpful even now. Right. If you are analyzing any policy, one thing is, does it reflect protectionism or is it moving towards opening up? And I'm not adding any value judgment to it, whether opening up is good or protecting your economy is good. But this is the debate that you will see. All right. And then, are we losing out on any opportunity present at any other place, in any other market, by not signing the agreement? And then, are we losing out on the opportunity of reform? So this is what generally the writings at that point in time said, right? So we added some critical assessment to India's decision to not sign the RCEP, right? So then the next part is, what is the way forward? What should India do then? So the question was asked, concerns on IPR provisions in the context of generic pharmaceutical sector, Rukhsar Shah, right? So this question was asked to Dr. Jaishankar many a times, and the government generally does not reply very clearly, right? Diplomatic answers are not very clear. So he said that not having an agreement is better than having a bad agreement. All right, that is the answer, right? Not signing the RCEP. Why did you not sign the RCEP? The idea is that it was not good for India's interest at that point in time. So Dr. Jaishankar said, not having the agreement is better than having a bad agreement. So the answer then comes through certain things that we will understand. First of all, there was a report of Parliamentary Standing Committee. Parliamentary Standing Committee on Commerce had a report titled Trade with ASEAN, in which it made certain good points. What good points were made? Number one, that free trade agreements are good in general, insofar as they promote trade. They lead to trade expansion or trade creation. So generally free trade agreements are good. That's the opinion of this Parliamentary Standing Committee. Then it comes to the second part, which is what? Then let's see how free trade agreements have worked in the context of India. So the understanding of this report was that when we look at India's free trade agreement, there has been a phase in which we signed free trade agreements. But when we analyze them, there are certain things which are clear. That the free trade agreements of the earlier era, were more intensive in the area of goods than in the area of services. So there was a mismatch between services and goods. So this is the nature of older free trade agreements. Secondly, when we look at free trade agreements, in most of the free trade agreements, India developed gradually a trade deficit. Meaning free trade agreements have not necessarily led to trade benefits, automatic trade benefits to India. Right? It is clear. Trade has expanded. Trade has increased. In all the relations we saw, trade has increased. Even with China, trade has increased without a free trade agreement. So generally trade has increased. But then if we look at the balance, it has increased imports more as compared to exports. So there has been a mismatch between exports and imports to the extent exports and imports increased, right, in relation to each other. So that's a simple point, that in most of the trade agreements, India has developed trade deficit. Thereby, the argument can be that while others have benefited more from India opening its market, India has not so much benefited from others opening their market. And this may have to do with the fact that India itself is a very large and untapped market, right? The second thing is this. Thirdly, the report said that when we are thinking about expanding our own manufacturing sector, prematurely opening our market may be detrimental to the idea of make in India. So that is what we notice, all right? And in simple terms, just look at our largest trading partners. Our largest trading partners are those with whom we don't have a free trade agreement. So our trade expanded largely with US, we don't have a free trade agreement. Our trade expanded with European Union, we don't have a free trade agreement. These are positive examples. And on a negative side, there is China. We don't have a free trade agreement. So meaning India's trade expansion is not so much sensitive to tariff rates, which are reduced under free trade agreement, rather than it is dependent on income changes in the export markets. All right, with richer economies, our trade has benefited, right? Economies where people have larger buying capacity, our trade has benefited. So we see that there may not be a direct correlation between free trade agreement and India's exports increasing. Rather, we see trade deficit increasing, meaning imports have increased. So these are the things that this report identified, and it said that free trade agreements should be signed. So in the future, what should India do is, it should ensure free trade agreements should ensure a balanced approach on goods as well as services. So what should happen? Free trade agreements. The way forward for India is to negotiate free trade agreements, but to ensure that these free trade agreements are balanced in terms of both goods and services, right? Second, it should ensure, free trade agreements should ensure increase in market access in short term, meaning there should be concrete benefits with these free trade agreements. We should ensure that there are concrete benefits, not promises that in the future this would happen. Or earlier the idea was signing of free trade agreement is a sign of economic liberalization, it would eventually benefit you. So not eventually benefit you, because in the long term we are all dead. In the short term, it should be ensured that the free trade agreement lead to concrete benefits. What kind of benefits? Primarily expanding India's market reach. So that is the kind of agreement that we should be signing. That is what the agreement says. And thirdly, these free trade agreements should be such which complement the domestic priorities. Complement the domestic priorities. Meaning what? Domestic priorities like earlier make in India. Now let's say we have a priority called Atmanirbhar Bharat. So we must ensure that the terms of these free trade agreements are not contradictory to domestic priorities, like increasing the share of manufacturing in India's economy. Rather, they should complement them. That is what we should do. So then if you see, for example, the current free trade agreement with UAE, what have you read? If you have read simple points, current affairs mein aaya tha, if you did not make it complicated, you simply understood that the free trade agreement with UAE promises addition of 1 million jobs in India's economy through sectors like better market access for sectors like textiles. All right. Go back and read that current affairs. This point you will find there that it would increase 1 million jobs. So that's what we are saying. That they should show short-term promise of short-term benefit, and they should be complementary to Make in India. And ultimately, why Make in India or Atmanirbhar Bharat? One primary objective is to increase adequate employment for Indians. यही तो objective है, right? If we have to take advantage of our demography, so if you have to prevent demographic disaster and convert our demographic potential into demographic dividend, the one way is to ensure that adequate gainful employment is available in India for the young people. That's the idea, and this is what the standing committee's report is saying in that particular year, right? So we generally take this idea in the context of other agreements also, and in that context it means that the doors are not closed, and this shows you the thinking in India on FTA. There has been a rethinking on FTAs. After 2011, we did not sign any free trade agreement, right? Because gradually, this was the time by which the result of various free trade agreements were visible, patterns were visible. So 2011 onwards, we did not sign any free trade agreement. 2022, what is happening? And I have been repeating this. We are signing a free trade agreement with UAE. We are negotiating a free trade agreement with Australia, with United Kingdom, with Canada, with European Union also. We have restarted our free trade agreement. So meaning the last 10 years were about a rethinking in India on economic priorities, free trade agreements, all right? So that is something that you will see. So first of all, doors for joining the RCEP are not closed yet, meaning the opportunity remains for India to join the RCEP. India was one of the original negotiators, and other countries, all the other countries, Southeast Asian countries, Japan, Australia, even China would like to have India in the RCEP. Without India, RCEP loses its attraction. All right, without India, RCEP loses its attraction. What is attractive in RCEP? India's market. So we have that leverage, and other countries would like India to join, right? So then India needs to ensure its interests are considered and concerns addressed. So that's one simple solution, right? That's one simple solution. That RCEP is still open for us. We can join it any point in time. We can simply give a notice that we want to join, and then we commence negotiations for joining the agreement. And then in that negotiation, what should we ensure? That our interests are defended, safeguarded, and our concerns are addressed. If that happens, we can join the RCEP, right? It is not closed. Second, negotiating free trade agreements with other important partners. So that's another way. There are economies where we are poised to gain more by signing a free trade agreement. For example, European Union free trade agreement has been stuck since 2007. We started in 2007. It is precisely because we don't agree to certain conditions of European Union, and we would like to safeguard our interests, that we have negotiated hard. Now the negotiations have opened again. So then that is an opportunity that we sign this agreement. So signing newer agreements with beneficial partners. UAE is another example. So with UAE we signed the agreement, and that is in the period after not signing the RCEP. Working to review existing bilateral FTAs, free trade agreements. So another thing is that if we want to address the concerns of India, we can do so through existing agreements. We have a free trade agreement with ASEAN, and we have a trade deficit and issue of market access in services. So that free trade agreement can be reviewed, and this is what we are doing. This is what we are trying to do right now. We have a free trade agreement with Japan. We can review it. We are in the process of reviewing it. It has completed 10 years. We have a free trade agreement with South Korea. We can review it. We are reviewing it. All right. So that is the meaning of it, that working to review the existing bilateral FTAs. So what we have, we make full advantage of it. And then fourth simple suggestion is strengthening domestic manufacturing to make it competitive. Strengthening domestic manufacturing to make it competitive. So we sooner or later we have to sign free trade agreement. Sooner or later we will open up our economy. So till we are protecting our economy, what we need to do is we need to ensure that our manufacturing sector makes progress as soon as possible. Right? We cannot for eternity continue to safeguard our manufacturing sector. We need to make it competitive. Right? If you want to beat China, if you want to become, let's say, a $5 trillion economy, our vehicle is manufacturing. But there has to be a time frame for it. We can't say that it would happen in 70 years. Right? So that is another idea. That simultaneously do these things. Strengthen domestic manufacturing. Work on domestic reforms, which helps India's manufacturing. Right? So these are the ways in which RCEP or other free trade agreements can be seen. So what have we done so far? Let me remind and revise for you. All right? Let me revise for you. 1. We understood what RCEP is. 2. We understood that India negotiated the RCEP. So there may have been some merits to RCEP or participating in the negotiations. 3. India decided eventually not to sign the agreement. So there may have been certain reasons. Right? So broadly we understood the reasons, and then specifically we tried to make sense of it. What concerns were there? Thirdly, next we tried to understand, can we criticize this decision? So yes, people writing in economic newspapers have different views on this. Some would say it is good, some would say it is bad. So first we defended India's decision, and then we said that there may be some criticism that we should take into consideration. Right? And 3 major ones is what we talked about, because these are issues of long-term policy. And then we said, what are the options then for India? Right? Because there are no clear options. There is no yes or no. Should we sign FTAs? So there is no clear yes or no. If we sign FTAs, then what should we remember? We should remember our experience. So we went to the Parliamentary Standing Committee's report, which clearly identified certain pattern. And then we said, what should India do in terms of signing the agreement? India should prioritize few things. Balance between goods and services, immediate short-term benefit, and also complementarity with domestic priorities. And thereby we then moved forward, what are India's options? So India's options are RCEP, keep the doors open for RCEP. If your interests are safeguarded, if your concerns are addressed, signing the RCEP still remains an option. That is an easy option. All right? We can remain outside of it or decide to sign it. But we need to ensure that we safeguard our interests. So that position does not change. Then signing newer FTAs. FTAs with whom? With economies where we hope to benefit the most. Right? So we signed with UAE and we are negotiating with other partners. And then what should we do? We should work within the existing FTAs. The concerns can be addressed in the existing FTAs. review of India-ASEAN FTA, review of India-Japan FTA, review of India-South Korea FTA. All in different phases are right now going on, right? And then we said that ultimately it's all about making ourselves competitive. We cannot grow far by simply remaining protective, right? So suppose if India was like US, we still can benefit from being protective. We can afford to be protective. But at the size of 3 trillion, we cannot expect that we will reach to 10 trillion by remaining protective only, right? So ensure that global environment is conducive for India's growth and domestic environment is also conducive for India's growth, and that would simply be by improving the efficiency in our domestic manufacturing, by skilling, by investing more in R&D, by improving infrastructure, right? That is something that when we say improve manufacturing, it means a lot of things, right? So then there is no problem in voice, only the video is lagging too much. Resolved. Okay, fine. So this is what we understood. So this is one example of issues in the Indo-Pacific, issues involving ASEAN of strategic nature, of the long-term nature. This is something that India would have to keep on thinking. Now the next issue of strategic nature involving ASEAN, involving Indo-Pacific. I hope we have not done South China Sea. Have we? South China Sea kiya hai? Right. So that is the next issue. Sort of a case study. South China Sea issues. So one, we saw economic issue and its strategic dimensions, meaning long-term dimensions. And now we see another issue which has larger security defense dimensions. And that's why it is strategically significant issues in the South China Sea. So if you look at South China Sea, and we do it shortly, let me first pull a map of South China Sea. I hope you can give me some time. Okay, so this is South China Sea, right? Now South China Sea, when we were looking at the map of Southeast Asia in the context of the Indo-Pacific, we had seen South China Sea. We had made certain note of the facts like Malacca Strait connects Indian Ocean with South China Sea, right? So this is the geography of South China Sea. It is an important part of the Pacific. South China Sea is surrounded on the north by the coast of China, and to its west, east and south are countries of Southeast Asia. So it is an important part of the Pacific surrounded by China and countries of Southeast Asia. So regionally, where is it located? It is located in Southeast Asia and between Southeast Asia and China, right? So it certainly is a regional issue in which countries of Southeast Asia are involved, countries like China are involved, but it also is of global significance. Why is it of global significance? Because if there is any trade which is moving from east to west to east and east to west, from Pacific to the Indian Ocean, it is moving through South China Sea. So it is also globally significant. It is also globally significant. Significant proportion of global trade flows through South China Sea, right? So then what does this map tell you? This map tells you a few things. That South China Sea is both regionally significant for relations between Southeast Asia and China, and is globally significant. What happens in South China Sea is also of global significance. What is happening in South China Sea is interesting, because many people say that this is where the Third World War would start. So there are features in South China Sea. What features? Features like Paracel Islands, all right, and features like Spratly Islands. These are two of the largest features, in South China Sea, Spratlys and Paracel, right? And now there are other small features like, let's say, Mischief Reef, Hughes Reef, Johnson South Reef, Fiery Cross Reef, Quaternion Reef, Subi Reef, Duncan Island, Woody Island, Scarborough Shoal. These are some smaller features. You don't need to remember all of them. Remember, I have told you that remember at least Spratly and Paracel. These two things you should remember. And then rest depends on what has been in news, right? So these features then are subject to contestation between different countries. Different countries have claims over them, right? And then some of these claims are very extensive. For example, this is called the 9-dash line. 9-dash line. So it simply represents China's claim. All right, 9-dash line. China shows a map and says 9-dash line. This is a map of 1940s which shows with these 9 dashes in China's claim. So meaning China is claiming more than 90% of South China Sea, which is a laughable claim. All right, you cannot do that, but China is doing that. I can also show a map. Let's say we can show a map of 1000 years back. ये हमको मिला है पुरानी किताबों में, which shows that India has claim over South China Sea. So that would also not be a just claim. So what China is doing is not a just claim. And then other countries may also have the claim. For example, basing their claims in, for example, let's say in UNCLOS. So this is something that Vietnam would say is its claim. All right. So what Vietnam is claiming covers Spratly Islands as well as Paracel Islands. All right. And then it's very clear that if Vietnam is right, then China is wrong. If China is right, then Vietnam is wrong. And then this is what the Filipinos may claim. All right. If, let's say, UNCLOS is applied. If UNCLOS is applied, this would be Philippines' claim. Right. Then this is something that Malaysia can claim. All right, this is something that Malaysia can claim, and this is something that Indonesia can claim, right? And of course, if you consider Taiwan to be an independent claim, then what China is claiming is Taiwan's claim. All right, and ultimately this is what China is basing its claims on, right? Taiwan's claim. So China and Taiwan's claim are similar. So suppose China's claim is accepted, and we accept that South China Sea is actually China's sea. What would happen? China would be able to decide which ships pass through this region, which flights fly over this region. All right, because now this is Chinese territory. So then, if this is controlled by China, then it means any trade flowing from west to east is also controlled by China. All right. So that's where it would be a global concern, right? And that's why, if you would remember, in the context of Indo-Pacific, we use certain terms that countries have certain rights: freedom of navigation, freedom of overflight, freedom of unimpeded lawful commerce. All right, these freedoms are there with countries. So thereby, this is an interesting case. And then you see certain other features on the map. What is this showing? This is simply referring to how, in defense of their claims, each of these countries may be doing certain things, right? So China is building new realities, other countries are responding to it. China is militarizing, other countries are also militarizing. Now the question is, who stops this? Because there is no question that China's claim would be accepted, right? So thereby we reach to an understanding about the nature of South China Sea issues. So what are South China Sea issues about? South China Sea, the question of South China Sea is a question about sovereignty, sovereignty over territory. Whose sovereignty? Who controls these territories? And then rights and entitlements. What rights and entitlements flow from sovereignty over these territories? Who controls the resources? So for example, some people argue that this region may also have rich reserves of hydrocarbon, and certainly fisheries is there. So who has rights over them? So that's one thing that is very clear, that this is what these issues are about. Now what complicates this issue is that there are claims and counter claims. There are claims and counter claims over the features, larger features like Spratlys and Paracel. For example, between China and Vietnam, right? China has a claim, Vietnam has a claim. So this is something which is complicating the issue. Now there may be no complication if human beings were very peaceable creatures, right? If we were very peaceful creatures, well, which our history does not tell us that we are, then there is no problem. We can coexist. The same person can call this particular piece of land their land, other can also call it their land. They can develop some usage. In any case, we don't need whole lot, all right? But this is not the case. So then there is always a dispute. There is scarcity and there is dispute. People may claim the same thing. So the way of resolving the dispute is twofold. Either you develop certain principles on the basis of which you resolve the dispute. So that's why there are courts. That's why there is law. Or you decide among yourself who is more powerful. And that's why there is also property dispute, in which there is property dispute generally would be of civil in nature, but along with property disputes you also have criminal cases. People are murdered, people fight with each other. So that is another way. You have a war. In your war you defeat the other countries and then establish your claim. Nobody is there to challenge your claim. So then you resolve the issue. Now preference is yours, right? Marzi aapki hai. So here one thing is visible, that there is no easy solution to these issues. It is not happening anytime soon. There is no clearly agreed upon rule or basis on which the solution may come, and there is no war right now which is happening. So in the interim, what is happening is of concern. One is China's expansive claims based on the 9-dash line complicates the situation. Meaning the most expensive claim is from China. Others still can be satisfied with smaller claims. Vietnam, etc. Others still can satisfy. But China's claim is so expensive that there is no compromise which seems to be possible, right? And then what is happening is China is creating artificial structures. China is creating artificial structures to shore up its claims, or to strengthen its claims. So what China is doing is, it's creating facts on the ground, as we say, right? So it is creating facts which may strengthen its claim. It is claiming even a stone jutting out of the water as an island, and then it says that since we control this island, then we have exclusive economic zone of more than 200 nautical miles, right? It is claiming low tide structures. For example, shoals are low tide structures, right? Or some features in such sea would be low tide structures, which would only be visible in low tide, but they would be submerged when there is high tide. You can't call such features islands, and thereby logically they don't generate any kind of rights. So what China is doing is, it is creating artificial islands, right? It is dredging sand from the ocean bottom and then building concrete structures over this base, and thereby it is converting what are not islands into island-like features. It is creating, in simple words, artificial islands in South China Sea, right? So year-to-year comparison of South China Sea would show these changes. And then militarization of these structures or features by China and response by others in the region are increasing the strain, all right. So what is happening now? These structures have been created, and now China is placing artillery on these structures. China is building airstrips capable of operating aircraft fighters from these structures. China is deploying anti-access and denial technology which can prevent ships from moving close to these structures, right? So that is what China is doing, and there are other countries are also doing it. Other countries, whatever they control, they are also militarily strengthening themselves on these features. So the idea is the presence of disputes over sovereignty and territory, and then the presence of military installations in close proximity, mobilization of arms and ammunition in such close proximity may lead to a conflict on slightest of provocation. That's the idea, that even a slightest of misunderstanding may lead to a larger conflict. If you remember anything about World War I, that is how it happened, right? World War I, Archduke Ferdinand is assassinated, and then it leads to a string of events which eventually turn into the World War. So that is what people are arguing, that this is a powder keg, this is an explosive situation. So a few years back, before Russia-Ukraine happened, some strategic pundits would argue that this is where the Third World War may start, because the situation is becoming so tense, all right? Because disputes persist, there is no way out of it. Militarization is increasing, what China is doing is illegal, but then nobody has the ability to prevent China from doing it. So first of all, this is how the issue is becoming complicated. Now, if we see in the context of these issues, what are the actual concerns? So first of all, it's a regional issue. It's a regional issue where ASEAN and China are involved. So it's a factor of regional instability. Regional instability leading to conflict may lead to economic destruction or may cause hindrance in the process of economic integration in this region, right? Disruption of supply chains, movement of trade, that is what would happen. So then this may lead to global disruptions. Why? Because it is argued that $5 trillion worth of global trade passes through the channels of South China Sea. Regional instability and then possibility of global disruption of global trade, right? $5 trillion of trade moves through these channels, and then this may mean undermining of a rules-based order. Meaning, once you are in a conflict situation, it would not be very easy to ensure that rules are abided by countries. So meaning, what happened? First World War After the First World War, we created League of Nations. So that was an attempt to create a rules-based order. If you have any difficulty in understanding this. So some attempt at bringing rules which which guide the conduct of countries failed. Failed in what situation? When countries decided to unilaterally pursue their claims. When Germany started talking about Lebensraum, all right, or expansion of its living space. So then for Germany, the whole of Europe, most of European countries became Germany, all right, and it said that we would retake our claims. And then gradually, the situation of Second World War developed. And what did Second World War do? Second World War plunged the world in recession, all right, in a situation from which it took decades for countries to emerge. Involved countries and uninvolved countries also. Because if you would remember, India also provided support to British war efforts in the Second World War. So that is what we are saying, undermining of the rules-based order. So after Second World War, we created UN. We created set of treaties, agreements, arrangements. What are these? These are rules which try to guide the conduct of countries in areas where there would obviously be differences. All right. So then if with this happens, this would lead to further destruction of undermining of rules-based order. And it is visible. Why? Because there have been efforts made by countries to legally address their concerns. So for example, in 2013, Philippines took China for arbitration, right, under its right provided by UNCLOS. So the Philippines said that China is undermining its rights, which it is entitled to under legal principles of UNCLOS, United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. What does this mean? This means that China's conduct in this region has been not only creating artificial structure, militarizing, but China is also dictating terms. For example, it issued a moratorium on fishing, and it prevented the Filipinos from fishing close to their own coast. All right. So that is something that Philippines complained against. That how can China do this? Issue moratorium on fishing, and then preventing its fishermen from fishing in the waters which Philippines claims to be its own waters. So Philippines is a small country. It cannot go to war with China. So that's where rules comes into picture. Small countries would prefer rules. Why? Because they cannot compete on the basis of power with larger countries. And that's what rules do. So UNCLOS is a rule. So an arbitration proceeding was constituted, a tribunal was constituted under UNCLOS, and then the arbitration started. So what did China say? China first of all said the arbitration at the tribunal is beyond the jurisdiction. So China said, hum nahi mante. There is no jurisdiction of UNCLOS and its tribunal when it comes to issues of sovereignty. Issues of sovereignty are political issues. They are not decided by courts. Courts can't decide sovereignty and sovereignty related claims. That's what China is saying. So China said, it's all right, we don't accept. Okay, then the tribunal said it has the jurisdiction because it is not determining sovereignty. It is determining question of rights and entitlements, legalities involved in the actions in question, right? So then the tribunal issued an award in 2016, meaning it gave a judgment in 2016. And it simply reached to a conclusion that China's actions have no justification in law. All right? So it simply said there is no legal basis for China's claim or China's activities. So for example, it also went into questions like what is an island, what kind of rights accrue when you control an island, And on all these questions, its opinion went against what China was doing. So in simple terms, it said China's actions are not rooted in any legal principles. कुछ और हो सकता है, जादू हो सकता है, all right? लेकिन लॉ लीगली तो ये जस्टिफिएबल नहीं है. देयर इज नो लॉजिकल legal principle which justifies what China is saying. So that's what the tribunal said. Now what happened? China rejected the final award, meaning China said हम नहीं मानते, जो करना है कर लो. That's what China is saying. All right. So China, no country would say that what it is doing is illegal. It would say that our interpretation of the law is different. All right. So for example, if you go to a court, in the court, two lawyers are arguing on the same issue, using the same facts. But what differs? Claims and interpretations. तभी जज साहब का काम होता है सुनना दोनों को और उसके बाद जजमेंट देना कि भाई किसका क्लेम ज्यादा सही लगा. Right? So China is saying that we don't agree. So then what do you do? If a country like China is not willing to abide by proceedings of arbitration, right? When it has signed UNCLOS, the arbitration proceedings said that jurisdiction is there. The arbitration result said that what China is doing has no legal basis, and still China continues to do what it is doing. Then what is the solution? Philippines cannot enforce this judgment. Nobody can enforce this judgment. Suppose, let's say, the other step is Philippines goes to United Nations Security Council complaining that what China is doing may amount to a threat to peace. It is violating our interests and now it is not willing to abide by peaceful solutions. So what would happen at the Security Council? What always happens at the Security Council? You don't see any substantive action against veto. Though veto is a simple way of saying we don't see any substantive action against any permanent member of the Security Council. All right, by the virtue of they having the veto. So then, what is the next solution? The next solution is either a country, powerful country, or a coalition of countries, force China to change its behavior. Now the question is, who will bell the cat? कौन बिल्ली को घंटी पहनाएगा? कौन करेगा ये? So that is the question to which there is no answer, because if you do it, if you try to do it, it may lead to a situation like the World War. ये सब कहते हैं पर होगा कब पता नहीं, लेकिन जब भी होगा ये सबको पता है बहुत भयानक होगा, इसीलिए रुक जाते हैं. So that's why Russia is doing whatever it is doing. United States is imposing sanctions, but Russia is still doing whatever it is doing. Right? Because Russia says, and Russia has been very clearly saying, that we are open to use of all kinds of weapons to defend our interests. And implicitly that means using nuclear weapons. बात यहाँ पे आके रुक जाती है. Right? So US has been conducting freedom of navigation operations. US क्या करता है? US भी is challenging China. है ना? Whatever territories, for example, this is an island that China is controlling. US would pass close to it and move in a zigzag way, right? Because ships generally have the right to innocent passage. But if you are making some irregular movement, it may mean that you are not passing innocently. So US is passing through its naval ships from this region to challenge China, and this has been going on for last 15 years. Earlier China would be silent, now China also responds. So suddenly 8 submarines, aircraft carriers of China would appear close to the ships of US. So China is also saying that we would not allow you to challenge us in our own backyard. Right? So the game of cat and mouse is going on, but nobody knows whether it would be a solution. So thereby let's bring India, because we think that India can provide the solution, India's position. Let's bring India's position on this. Right? Many people are saying that India would provide break. Okay, go for a break. go for a break, please. And then after the break, we continue with this. And then this would be the end of Southeast Asia related discussion, and we move to Japan. Okay, let's get started. Sonu Yadav says, sir, there is also some online students. I am very cognizant of online students. If you have any questions, please send it. During the break, I sit in the class so that if anyone is not able to ask questions during the class, they can come and ask questions. If you have any questions, please send them. I will address them also. So, why are they not following UNCLOS? That is the question. That is the question that somebody asked me in the break also. ब्रेक पूरा हो गया है, अब मेरी तरफ ध्यान दे लें आपस में बात करने की बजाय. So then that is an interesting question, why China is not following UNCLOS. That's simple, because China can afford to not follow rules. It's simply the logic of power. Powerful countries often undermine international rules. US has done so, China has done so, other countries, Russia has done so, and I'm telling you that if it comes to it, we will also do so. Alright, it would happen in the future. Powerful countries, you always calculate कितना नुकसान होगा, ये नहीं माना तो कितना नुकसान होगा, क्या कर लेगा कोई ज़्यादा से ज़्यादा. And also it depends on what is your core interest, right? If your core interest is concerned, then you would not be thinking about international law, international sanctions. Let me give you an example. 1998, India for the second time tested and declared its nuclear capabilities. And what immediately followed was a series of sanctions on India. So India calculated two things. How important is having nuclear weapons for it? So it reached to the conclusion that it is very important because we live in a nuclear neighborhood. China has nuclear weapons. Two, was India aware that there would be adverse consequences? Yes, India was aware that there would be adverse consequences. So in relation to the importance of having nuclear weapons with the consequences, we chose that this is more important for us. And second, we had confidence that we would be able to withstand any consequences that would arrive out of it. So this is a calculation that we make. So suppose India is a 100 trillion US dollar economy one day. Our ability to withstand external challenges would be much greater, right? So then a US or China also calculate this, what is important for us. So for China, certain territorial questions would be much more important. So for that, China would be willing to go against international opinion also, and that is what China is doing. In its calculation, its interests are served by this kind of an action, right? But nobody says, as I said, nobody says that we are violating international law or any law. Everybody would say that our understanding of the law, our interpretation of the law is different. That is what people would say, right? And then if you are a weak country, you will generally like to have rules, you will generally like to follow rules. ऐसा नहीं कह रहा हूँ कि ये ज़रूरी है, मतलब रूल मानने का मतलब आप कमज़ोर हैं, ऐसा नहीं कह रहा हूँ. And I am not promoting the fact that कि रूल नहीं मानना चाहिए. But generally, if you are weak, your ability to resist external pressure is less. If you are strong, your ability to resist external pressure is high. Now the next thing which happens is this. When you look at rules and laws, your understanding comes from domestic nature of these things. So you think in India there is a constitution, there are laws, there are courts, all right? Everybody abides by the rule. But do they? Do everybody abide by the rule? No. If that was the case, then there would be no litigations in the court. Rules are violated, so existence of rule does not necessarily mean that rules would be followed. So rules are violated. Then what happens? The case goes to the court. Then what happens? Court hears to various arguments and gives an opinion, a judgment. Then what happens? After the judgment, you have to abide by the judgment, because if you don't abide by the judgment, there is a police force. So there is also a very simple understanding. Words without sword are, or covenants without sword are mere words. Rules without the backing of force, enforceability, sometimes are mere words. And this is seen in international relations, because international relations does not have any obvious enforceability mechanism. In international relations, there would always be exceptions. So things are binding, but only to the extent somebody can bind them to you. Only to the extent you decide that your interests are best served by following the rules rather than not following them. But if you decide that I am not going to follow the rule, and if you have the ability, you may still do so and avoid the consequences. Then what would happen? Then criticism would happen. All right? People would criticize you. So people are criticizing Russia right now. Is Russia going to stop doing what it is doing because there is criticism only? No. It would have an impact, right? No country would like to be persistently criticized. Every country would like to be known as a good international citizen. But only criticism is not going to stop Russia. There is nothing overwhelming that stops Russia right now. So that's why it has been so complicated when it comes to Russia-Ukraine war. Right. So India's position. India's position derives from a few things. For example, 50% of India's trade passes through South China Sea channels. So that's one thing why India is concerned. That's one thing why India is concerned about what is happening in South China Sea, or why India should be concerned, or what is the basis of India's view. Secondly, investments of the coast of Vietnam, investments of the coast of Vietnam in the hydrocarbon sector. So that is another commercial interest that we have, that in South China Sea off the coast of Vietnam, India's companies like ONGC have been involved in oil and gas exploration. India has made investments in these explorations. China has even tried to prevent India and Vietnam from doing that. So this is another legal basis, reasonable basis of why India should have a say or a view on this matter. Otherwise you can say South China Sea is far away, how are we concerned, right? And then concerns for balance of power and stability in Asia. That is the third larger region which may have many meanings. One, what China is doing in South China Sea is only a starting point for what China can do in rest of Asia. If China is not prevented from doing this in South China Sea, it is a springboard for China's power projection in rest of Asia. That's what we believe. Then in particular sense, it means if today China is doing what it wants to do in South China Sea, tomorrow who prevents it, what prevents it from doing that in Indian Ocean? All right? So that's the belief. Thirdly, in a very broad sense, India wants an equilibrium in Asia, equilibrium based on multipolarity. India does not want Asia to be dominated by China, or for that matter any set of powers. India thinks that in Asia there exist multiple cultures, multiple regions, thereby multiple important countries. So the affairs of Asia should be multipolar. It should not be based on domination by any single country. It should be multipolar, right? And this is what India is concerned. That if in South China Sea this continues, it would be detrimental for balance of power in Asia, equilibrium, strategic equilibrium in Asia. It would be particularly detrimental to India as well as generally detrimental to what India believes Asia should be. That is a multipolar Asia, right? Or this would be detrimental to stability in Asia. So thereby then what we see as India's position is something very obvious. So what would India do in these kinds of situations? Once you have developed an understanding of what India's general approach is, it simply becomes a stock position that you can repeat in any answer. So what would India do? What India says about this? Tell me. It's up to you. What would India say in these kinds of situations? Yes. Either India should approach positively for its own welfareism. Does not make sense. Meaning India should not do anything. That's what you're saying. Okay. Anyone else? Right. So that is what India would say always. Dialogue, diplomacy. In Russia's case, what is India saying? A, we advocate cessation of violence. We advocate certain principles should always be respected. How, we don't say. But we say that this is something that should happen. And thereby we say that there should be diplomatic, peaceful resolution of any differences, any concerns which are there. So India is the country which always would say peaceful, bilateral negotiations should be the basis. So that is what India says. That A, issues should be resolved, issues should be resolved by peaceful negotiations. And India says that this should happen by respecting international norms, right? So remember, we have been repeating this: rules-based order, freedom of navigation, freedom of overflight, freedom of unimpeded lawful commerce. What does this mean? This is what it means. That India would, if it says that there should be peaceful resolution, India would say that there are rules, there are principles which may help in this resolution. So that should be respected, rules of international norms. And then India supports ASEAN's efforts. India supports ASEAN's efforts to obtain a legally binding code of conduct, legally binding code of conduct with China in South China Sea. Right? So 2012 onwards, China and ASEAN had made efforts to negotiate a code of conduct. And you would recall, in the context of India-China border issues also, China's preference is code of conduct. You will recall from the discussion, that is what China does. Rather than resolving the issue, it would say, let's learn how to live with this. All right? So code of conduct has been an attempt by these two sides, China and ASEAN, that till the issues are resolved, we may learn how to live with it through certain code of conducts which would guide our action. So that is an interim solution that may be there. That if these countries can somehow come together and decide a code of conduct. So that prevents the conflict for some time, right? So India supports ASEAN's efforts to obtain a legally binding code of conduct with China in the South China Sea. These are the three positions of India that you will see. But apart from that, the issues of discussions on the idea of a rules based order at multilateral forums. That's what India argues for, if you would see, in its meetings with Quad, right? And increasingly at most of the places. Now India talks about the need for a rules-based order. So that is a signaling to China. For example, recently on a debate on collective security in the United Nations Security Council, India clearly said that collective security cannot be ensured till powerful countries continue to violate the sovereignty and territorial integrity of others. It is as applicable on the issues at the LAC as it is in the case of South China Sea. Advocacy of these kinds of issues. So when we go to larger platforms, we generally start talking about principles rather than countries or specific countries. So we, as far as possible, we would not like to name China or Pakistan. But when we talk about, let's say, terrorism, when we talk about, let's say, rules-based order, collective security, respect for sovereignty, territorial integrity, इसका क्या मतलब है? It should have a concrete meaning. It means that through this, we indirectly criticize the conduct of, let's say, China or Pakistan. So sometimes explicitly, sometimes implicitly. So use of principles is also a way of putting pressure on other countries, right? And talking about principles is easier till you don't have to enforce them, right? Till you don't have to enforce them, it is easier, na? It's low cost option. So you have two options: either you take action or you do what? Make Facebook posts, write ideal answers in UPSC ethics ke paper mein, right? So in the paper of ethics you write everything ideal. When you go to the service, what do? You do exactly opposite of what you have written. I'm not saying you should be doing it or you would be doing it, but that is the meaning of it. So when you write in your answer those good principles, nobody is questioning ki ye kaise hoga. So don't become too practical there. Have some principles in mind also. Nobody is asking you to solve things in a shortcut. क्योंकि हर खासतौर पे जब यूपीएससी की तैयारी कर रहे होते हैं तो क्या होता है कि हर किसी को लगता है कि नहीं यहाँ तो कुछ सॉल्यूशन दे के जाना है. भाई अभी आपकी उम्र नहीं है सॉल्यूशन देने की. So that is something that you should remember. So that's why when you articulate principles, write these words, it gives you good marks. That is the purpose of it, right? But then the real test would be whether you are able to abide by these principles for the rest of your life when you go to field, when you are in the service, right? So everything has a importance, has a significance. When we talk about principles, that also serves our interests, right? And generally that is the kind of position that India would take. So this is South China Sea. If you have any questions, you are more than welcome to ask those questions. If not, then what we do is we move towards the next country. So remember the larger direction, Indo-Pacific, starting with Southeast Asia, moving away from Southeast Asia now. Now moving towards the country called Japan. So you would recognize this. This is what? This is the flag of Japan. What does it represent? Sun. Red sun. What is a red sun? Japan is called the land of the rising sun. Nippon. Alright? You must have heard the term Nippon. So this is the flag of Japan, which represents rising sun. Land of the rising sun. An important country, important partner for India. Now let's look at the map of Japan. A few things that you may try to remember, right? One, where exactly is Japan located? So here is, if you have done what I suggest you to do, look at the atlas after I've shown you the map. Here is East China Sea, all right, and then somewhere here would be South China Sea, right? So East China Sea connected with South China Sea connected with Sea of Japan. So this is Sea of Japan. Sea of Japan is also called East Sea. These are two different bodies of water. East China Sea and East Sea are different, right? So what Japan calls Sea of Japan, China and Korea's would call East Sea, all right? East Sea. East China Sea यहाँ पे, and this is East Sea. Generally, Japan refers to it as East. Japan refers to it as Sea of Japan, and Korea, China would refer to it as East Sea, right? Now, from north to south, which are the important islands of Japan? Hokkaido, Honshu, the largest island, Shikoku, and Kyushu. So Japan has thousands of islands, but these are the four major islands where its population is located, right? So major islands of Japan: Hokkaido, Honshu, Shikoku, and Kyushu. Kyushu the southernmost, Hokkaido the northernmost island. Now Japan is located in the North Pacific, and Japan's neighbors are the Korean Peninsula, South Korea, North Korea, and here is Russia. But China is also not far away, and here notice two things. North Korea shares a border with China, South Korea and Russia. क्योंकि ये मैप में है तो ये भी दिमाग में एक बार बैठा लो. South Korea shares a border with Russia, China and South Korea. North Korea shares a border with these three countries, right? Because in the atlas sometimes this is not very clearly visible. So you know who are the neighbors of North Korea. Why is North Korea in news? Now North Korea has declared that it would not hesitate in using nuclear weapons if it is threatened. All right? So that is something that North Korea has done. It has made its intentions very clear that it would not be talking about denuclearization. It would not be giving up nuclear weapons. Right? So this has been a long standing problem. Sometimes there have been dialogues about denuclearization of North Korea, that North Korea would give up its weapons. But now North Korea is saying, no, we are not doing that, right? So then, let's look at some of the cities in Japan. This is Osaka, this is Nagoya. Have you heard of these in any context? Osaka, why have you heard of Osaka? Apart from the fact that it is an important industrial region. Osaka had held a summit of G20 in 2019, and in that G20 a batch is written here, debate on data was initiated by Western countries, US, Japan, etc. India was opposed to any negotiations of data at international stage. So thereby the formula that Japan proposed was data free flow with trust. All right, so Japan is also talking about principle. The interest of Western countries is to ensure free flow of data. And when the developing countries objected, the addition is with trust. Everybody should be taken into confidence. So that is why Osaka is known for Osaka track, apart from being an industrial town in this country. All right. And then Nagoya. We had seen a question on Nagoya. We had seen that question, right? There are some other cities of Japan that you may be aware of. Sendai, Kyoto, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, सबको पता होता है. Tokyo is the capital, सबको पता है. Right. So thereby, if you know these places, you know what is associated with them. Kyoto Protocol is a protocol to UNFCCC, which talks about binding emission cuts. Binding emission cuts by whom? Annexure 1 countries, developed countries. That is what happened as the first concrete step in under the UNFCCC, right? So then Nagoya Protocol. What is Nagoya Protocol? Nagoya Protocol is a protocol of Convention on Biodiversity. It is known by the name of Convention or Protocol to Genetic Resources, Access to Genetic Resources and Equitable Sharing. It is a protocol to Convention on Biodiversity, CBD, right? And then you have heard of Sendai. In what context have you heard of Sendai? Another city in Japan, Sendai. सेंडाई नहीं सुना अभी तक? पेपर 3 में होता है एक डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट. कोई बात नहीं हुआ है तो भी जनरली सिलेबस पहली बार आपने देखा होगा. एक सिंपल सा गूगल सर्च भी आप करते हैं कि यार डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट का क्या मतलब है, या ये मान के चल लिया कि जब ये होगा तभी मैं देखूंगा, या पिछले साल के क्वेश्चंस आप देखते हैं, है ना. सो सेंडाई फ्रेमवर्क इज on disaster risk reduction, right? It is the current framework that international community has adopted, relevant from 2015 to 2030. So far there have been 3 frameworks in terms of international understanding of the principles of disaster management and their incorporation in domestic policy. So this is the latest one, which talks about disaster risk reduction. Sendai framework on disaster risk reduction. Right? Cities of Japan, and cities of Japan also help you in remembering some of the important international agreements, treaties associated with them. Kyoto Protocol, Protocol to UNFCCC. Nagoya Protocol, Protocol to Convention on Biodiversity. Right? Similarly, Cartagena Protocol also is a protocol to Convention on Biodiversity. Right? And then Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. चलें आगे. So अब आपने समझ लिया जापान को, right? So now what you will do is you will go back and at least try and look at your atlas of the region that we have talked about. Remember, UPSC does not ask very complex location based questions. It asks awareness based questions. So don't miss out on that. And the easiest way of that would be, whenever something is being taught, you simply go back and pay attention to it. Look at the atlas. जब भी कोई जगह न्यूज में हो, कहीं dispute हो रहा हो, what do? You look at the atlas and make a simple awareness about the location. That is what you do. What happened, sir? आपकी आवाज यहां तक आ रही है. When you are speaking, yes, I'm talking to you. Yes. आप बार बार साइड में देख के बात कर रहे हैं तो मुझे सुनाई दे रहा है. आपका कुछ छूट गया बताइए. हाँ, लिखिए. चलिए. So let's talk about India-Japan relations. What is this relationship talked about? What is this relationship called? What is this relationship called? हर रिलेशनशिप का एक नाम होता है. गुड रिलेशनशिप, वेरी गुड. अब गुड रिलेशनशिप के फेज से आगे आ चुके. वो गुड रिलेशनशिप वाला क्वेश्चन था पाकिस्तान के लिए, बांग्लादेश के लिए, नेपाल के लिए. अब हर रिलेशन का एक स्पेसिफिक नाम होता है. हाँ, सिविलाइजेशन, पता नहीं. चलिए, थोड़ा सा एक नजर दौड़ा ली होती प्रिंटेड मटेरियल पे तो ये सिंपल हो जाता. सो वी कॉल दिस रिलेशनशिप नाउ इन द करंट कॉन्टेक्स्ट स्पेशल strategic and global partnerships. Special, strategic and global partnership. That is what we call this particular relation. कर लीजिए आप. ये सब जो करना, इसके लिए एक जगह चुनना चाहिए. कहाँ चुनना चाहिए? कोने में बैठना चाहिए. है ना, अगर ये सारी चीजें करनी हो तो. बातचीत, आपस में जोक शेयर करना, उम्र का तकाजा होता है. इस उम्र में ऐसा होता है, बात करने का बहुत मन होता है. तो उसके लिए आप आराम से एक जगह चुन लें. सामने मत बैठे आई लाइन के, क्योंकि यहाँ कैमरा भी यही लगा हुआ है, तो मैं अवॉइड भी नहीं कर सकता आपको. राइट. चलिए, स्पेशल, स्ट्रैटेजिक एंड ग्लोबल पार्टनरशिप. It simply means that we say that this is a special relationship. When we say that there is a strategic partnership, it has two meanings. One, it is an important relationship from a long-term perspective. Second, it is a relationship in which we have a distinct lack of major political contention. ना कोई political contention है major, और ये relationship लंबे समय के लिए हमारे लिए महत्वपूर्ण है. जब भी हम strategic partnership कहते हैं, उसका ये मतलब होता है. अब हम कहते हैं कि स्पेशल, स्ट्रैटेजिक एंड ग्लोबल पार्टनरशिप, उसका कोई मतलब नहीं होता है. उसका सिंपल मतलब ये होता है दैट रवांडा इज ऑल्सो अ स्ट्रैटेजिक पार्टनर फॉर अस, यूएस इज ऑल्सो अ स्ट्रैटेजिक पार्टनर फॉर अस, मेनी अदर कंट्रीज आर स्ट्रैटेजिक पार्टनर्स फॉर अस. सो व्हाट इज द डिफरेंस? सो देन वी से that you are a strategic partner, you are a special and privileged strategic partner, you are a special and global strategic partner, you are a comprehensive strategic partner. So this is simply difference in nomenclature of different relations. Substantially, it does not mean anything different. All right, it means it's a special relationship, and that's the name for it. What is the utility? If you remember this in the examination, this becomes one jargon that you use prominently. Highlight it and show it to the examiner that I know what you are talking about. I'm very intelligent, right? So that is what you have to show to the examiner. So then what does this mean? So any relationship then opens up itself to a framework. So India-Japan strategic partnership is based on one, and now comes the obvious factors, cultural and civilizational ties. Not possible. Cultural and civilizational ties. All right. So what does this mean? If you look at any relationship, we have talked about these kinds of factors. Sri Lanka ke saath, right? So thereby, a question was asked online. All right, a question was asked online. Sharanveer says, in mains, do we need to substantiate our all way forward points with examples? It's ideal that if you want to differentiate your answer from others, you use some examples. Wherever possible, use examples. But you cannot excessively write in terms of examples. So some students have a habit of writing very specifically. So what would happen? In 150 words, you would have a lack of points, or too many points. In 250 words, you have a lack of points. So thereby the suggestion is A. First, you need to have a broad classification of parts of the answer, broad points, principles. And B, whenever the opportunity is, increase the words that you want like to write through examples, through mentioning facts. So in this way, what happens is, when you broadly have a classification for any area, you can write 150 words answer, where you only write broad things with few examples. When you write 250 words, you write the broad things, you can have sub-themes within them, and you can use many examples. So wherever the question requires and you have it, use examples. Even in way forward, you can use example, but that does not mean that every point should have an example. That means have some examples which are handy in any situation. That's the question that Sharanveer had asked. So when you have, for example, broad idea that it is a special strategic and global partnership, one example would be cultural and civilizational ties. So this becomes an example that this is a relationship which is special because of cultural and civilization ties. Now there can be a very specific example also. For example, shared heritage of Buddhism. Shared heritage of Buddhism. Now this example can also become even more specific. That in the 7th century, the consecration of Buddha statue in a temple at Nara in Japan, Nara temple in Japan, was conducted by an Indian monk named Bodhisena. Alright? So then this is the way in which you can look at examples and look at general points. One, if somebody asks you in 1 second, give me an idea of India-Japan relations. So rather than fumbling for words, you can say that India and Japan share a special strategic and global partnership. Now somebody gives you an opportunity to then say, tell me something more about it. So you say that it is based on cultural and civilizational linkages. If somebody gives you an opportunity to say it more about it, you say that this means, for example, that we share linkages of Buddhism. Buddhism spread from India to China to Japan, and that links us. If somebody gives you further opportunity to say or write, you say, for example, this is exemplified by the consecration of Buddha statue at the Nara temple in Japan in the 7th century AD, right? So these are different levels of writing. It is not simply about copying, it is developing a formula of your own. आपको अपना formula खुद develop करना है, क्योंकि अपने को सबसे ज़्यादा कौन समझता है? आप. Right? What a teacher does or what anyone does who is teaching a large class would provide you a common basic point through which you can do that. And specifics if you have doubts, if you want to know more. Secondly, it is based on political and diplomatic linkages which these countries have established. So you will find that in this relationship, for example, there is frequent interaction at the highest level. For example, India and Japan have a summit level interaction. With few countries, India has summit level interaction. Summit which happens annually. So annual summits which take place is an example of diplomatic and political linkages or diplomatic and political engagements. Alright, that would be a better word, engagements. So for example, annual summits take place. So if you understand it, somebody asks you about India-Japan relations, in short, the answer is that it is a special global strategic partnership. Somebody gives you more opportunity, you say cultural and civilizational, right? And then you add another border point, diplomatic and political engagements or linkages. Then somebody gives you an opportunity to say more. You say, for example, India and Japan have an annual summit system. Alright? Meaning their prime ministers meet annually. And this is not a regular part of all relations. ऐसा नहीं होता कि हर साल India US president मिल रहे हैं. For example, India US don't have a summit system. India has summits with few of our partners. Japan, Singapore, Russia, and then now with Australia also we have started summit, but that is going to be a biennial summit, meaning it would happen every 2 years. So summit is the highest level of meeting, and if it happens regularly, we can say that we have strong political and diplomatic engagements. Similarly, from time to time, there are other layers of dialogues which are added. So India and Japan have started a 2+2 dialogue. Dialogue between foreign minister and defense minister. So that shows you one thing, that the intent is to further regularize the interaction, not only simply summit, but other levels of interactions, diplomatically, politically. 2+2 dialogue simply means that now we view our relationship so significantly that we address certain issues at a common platform. So rather than having a separate meeting of external affairs minister and defense minister, we have created one platform where external affairs minister and defense ministers can meet, because issues of foreign affairs, issues of external affairs, and issues of defense have an overlap. So in order to remove the difficulties of different jurisdictions, हर ministry अलग अलग काम करती है, right? We are now bringing jointness to this approach. We are addressing the issues of foreign relations and issues of defense relations at the same platform. So that's 2+2 dialogue that India has started with Japan. And this is also a dialogue that we have with only few partners. US, Japan, Russia we have started most recently, and now with Australia also we have constituted a 2+2 dialogue. And apart from that, there are multiple other dialogues that India and Japan have. But this suffice to say that we understand what is the meaning of diplomatic and political linkages. And then we have significant economic engagements with each other. So this then simply means that either you have some agreements. What do you focus on in international relations? Either you remember some agreements as examples. So India and Japan have a trade relationship which is based on complementarity and agreements like CEPA, Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, which have been in force since 2011. 2011, this has been in force. So agreement and then figures, data. So for example, 2021-22, India's trade with Japan stood at 21 billion US dollars. 21 billion US dollars worth of trade. So this is another way of thinking how you can bring diversity in your answer by using some agreements. Agreement is also a data that you are presenting, an example that you are presenting. So it is not necessary that you always say, for example, you write a sentence which is specific, that itself becomes an example. So 21 billion US dollars of trade. And then this relationship also has a growing FDI plus ODA. Foreign direct investment, meaning Japanese companies investing in India, the numbers are increasing. Official development assistance, which is aid and concessional loans coming from Japan, that is also increasing. So that is economic linkages between India and Japan. Then, or you can go further here, you can say that India and Japan also have a currency swap arrangement, and then you move forward and say that this relationship has other aspects. For example, technology. So two prospective areas of technology cooperation. One is space technology. Another is nuclear technology. Why is India interested in Japan? Because of technology, right? So that also adds another layer. Now, depending on the need of the question, you can shorten any of these categories. And then you can talk about geostrategic engagements. Geostrategic engagements, right? So then it means that today larger confluence on the Indo-Pacific is driving India-Japan relations, that these two countries have common views on Indo-Pacific, common views on Indo-Pacific, right? That's largest level of geostrategic convergence that these two sides have. So geostrategic convergence on the Indo-Pacific is a driver of India-Japan relations in current times. Similarly, you see India's Act East. India has a policy called Act East. Japan has a policy which is called Free and Open Indo-Pacific. So we can argue that this geostrategic convergence is seen in terms of convergence between India's Act East approach and Japan's Free and Open Indo-Pacific approach. ऐसा कह सकते हैं हम. Or we can say that it is seen in terms of these countries enhancing defense ties. Defense ties either through 2+2 dialogue or exercises. For example, Japan-India military exercise. JIMEX. Alright? JIMEX. Or, for example, the exercise which is called Shinyu Maitri. Another military exercise between India and Japan. Or, for example, the exercise called Malabar, in which Japan was made a permanent participant in 2015. Right? So this is another way in which we see how geostrategic engagements are driving the relations. Or we can say larger geostrategic engagements also mean that these countries have common views in terms of global governance and the need for reforms. So India and Japan are part of a group called G4 at United Nations Security Council, who want a reform in the permanent category of membership. India, Japan, Germany and Brazil. They have common views. What is common? All of them want to become permanent members. So now what they are doing? They are coordinating with each other on this matter. They are developing a common position on this matter. So this is something that also can be said. G4, UNSC, right? Or they are important partners at forums like G20, or they are participant of newer forms of dialogues like Quad, right? So that also becomes a lot of examples. And then a specific factor that start making sense to many about why India and Japan may be coming closer, because they have common concerns on the impact of rise and assertion of China, right? So then this then binds the whole equation. If you have to write anything on India-Japan relations, these are the things that you should be trying to mention, that this is something that has happened between these sides, right? This is something that has happened between these sides, that they have a partnership which is called Special Strategic and Global Partnership. It is based on cultural and civilizational linkages, which means ancient linkages of Buddhism, which means ancient linkages which are part of even the current civilizational structure in India and Japan. For example, if you would see, many of the names of deities or forms of deities in India and Japan are similar, common. If you see today, we commemorate these kinds of relations by engaging in partnerships like sister city agreement between Kyoto and Ahmedabad, Kyoto and Varanasi. Kyoto and Varanasi are sister cities, right? So that is what we commemorate. Now if you see, this cultural and civilizational linkage can also be brought in terms of either personalities like Vivekananda visiting Japan. All right, he visited Japan. So that is something that you read anything, you will find the mention of Japan. Gurudev Rabindranath Tagore also visited Japan, and there he gave a lecture on nationalism. He criticized the nationalism of, मैं आ रहा हूँ सर, उस पे भी आ रहा हूँ, मैं आ रहा हूँ, उस पे भी आ रहा हूँ. Develop the habit of not speaking when somebody else is speaking, ताकि clarity रहे. आपके पास भी मौका है, मेरे पास भी. Right? So then Gurudev Rabindranath Tagore visited Japan and he gave a speech on nationalism, criticized Japanese nationalism, criticized nationalism in general. Right? And then J.R.D. Tata also spent time in Japan. So that is also another example of cultural engagement. He was an admirer of Japanese work culture. Right? And then there is a lesser known name but very important name, which is a common link between India and Japan. That is of Justice Paul. All right. So Justice Paul served in the War Crime Tribunal after the Second World War. Various war crime tribunals were established after the Second World War. And you mentioned Subhash Chandra Bose. So Netaji had allied with Japan when it came to Second World War. His primary objective was India's independence. But the general alignment in terms of World War was between the two contenders. One is the Allied powers, which is generally US, UK, France, Russia, USSR. And then on the other side were Axis powers, Japan, Italy and Germany. So after the war, the Allied powers won and the Axis powers were defeated. So war crime tribunals were established to establish the responsibility of war. So tribunals like Nuremberg Tribunal, created in Germany. So a tribunal was created in Tokyo also. And Justice Paul was one of the judges in that tribunal. So while the Western judges put the entire onus of the Second World War on Japan, Justice Paul disagreed. And he said the responsibility of war also lies with the Western powers, not only with Japan. So Japanese are very keen about national honor. All right. So these are cultural issues that you understand. So what Justice Paul did is still remembered in Japan, because Justice Paul did not humiliate Japan like the Western judges. All right. Like the Western judges, he did not humiliate Japan. He gave the onus on the fact that he put the emphasis on the fact that Western countries are also responsible. So Japan cannot only be held responsible unilaterally, right? So this is another way in which you can say cultural and civilizational linkages between India and Japan in concepts of national honor, right? And then you move forward, and then you come to the end of the Second World War. So there the diplomatic linkages between India and Japan start. In what ways? After the Second World War, Japan had to sign peace treaties with the Allied powers. The most important peace treaty in this context was the San Francisco Treaty. A San Francisco conference was organized. India was also invited. But India refused to join a treaty with Japan on that occasion, and India signed a separate peace treaty with Japan in 1952. A separate peace treaty with Japan, 1952. Now, what is the significance of that? So India said that 1952, Japan had promulgated its new constitution. Japan's sovereignty was restored, right? So before that, India said that we are not going to sign a treaty with Japan which is under the control of Western powers. So when Japan's sovereignty was restored, we signed a separate treaty with Japan rather than joining with others. So this is also a way of showing respect to Japan, which the Japanese remember. All right, which the Japanese remember. 1952, the peace treaty India signed with Japan. Why? Because India was also among the Allied powers. So it did not do so while Japan was under Western control. It did so when Japan's new constitution came into power and Japan's sovereignty was restored. Then if you move forward, you will find that the diplomatic linkages continued, but that there was a larger geostrategic divergence. What divergence? While India moved on the direction of non-alignment, Japan moved towards US alliance. So that larger diplomatic the geostrategic divergence was there. Japan a part of the Western Bloc, India choosing for non-alignment. But bilaterally these countries didn't have any dispute. So this relationship, if we see over the years, developed on the basis of the fact that they lacked any significant political contention of their own. And thereby there were visits. For example, Prime Minister Nehru went to Japan early on in the 1950s itself, and visits from Japan's prime ministers to India also. Now, what you would see as a result of this is investments and technology coming from Japan. So Japan was one of the first countries in terms of partners in certain important areas of industry. For example, Suzuki Corporation was part of what was then Maruti Suzuki Enterprise, right? For the manufacturing of four-wheelers, automobiles in India. So investment from companies like Suzuki became an important source of industrialization that took place in India in the post-independence period. And then we see 1990s. 1990s, when India faced liquidity crisis, one of its important lenders was Japan, right? So see what Sri Lanka is doing today. Sri Lanka has a staff level agreement with IMF, but before it reaches to the final settlement, it would have to first make an understanding with its largest creditors, Japan, China and India. That is what Sri Lanka is doing. So at that point in time, when we also sought the help of the IMF in the early 1990s, we had to first get an endorsement from Japan. So Japan was one of the few countries which helped India in the context of the liquidity crisis of early 1990s, right? And then you come to the mid 1990s. Mid 1990s, the most important event that happens, which is worth remembering, is 1998 nuclear tests. So at that point in time, Japan joined with other Western countries in sanctions on India, right? 1998, in Japan conducted a nuclear test. India conducted a nuclear test, and Japan was critical of it. Why? Why? Because Japan is the only country which so far has faced a nuclear weapon. है ना? जो कभी लड़ाई में गए नहीं, जिन्होंने कभी लड़ाई की नहीं, उनके लिए लड़ाई की बात करना आसान होता है. People who have not seen the war, or people who have not gone to war, would find it easy to talk about war. But people who have faced war would be very responsible when talking about war. So similarly, Japan has faced nuclear weapons, and that is the only occasion when nuclear weapons have been used. Since then, nuclear weapons are there for showcase. Every now and then, countries keep on saying that we will use them, but everyone knows how destructive is the use. So thereby, Japan has a distinct dislike for countries developing nuclear weapons. So Japan joined in sanctions against India when India tested nuclear weapons. But that did not become a major constraint in this relationship, because there were larger complementarities in this relationship which were driving it. Number one is that India's market was attractive to Japanese companies. Japan itself was earlier in recession, then it faced stagflation, and then generally what you would see is that, for example, Japan's currency is pegged lower as compared to Indian rupee. So Japan's economy has its own unique structural problems. One of the problems is a graying population, aging population, right? And it has industrialized to the extent it could. So now where would be the next growth engine? Next growth engine would be Japanese companies investing in low cost manufacturing bases like India. So India's market is an opportunity, investments in India is an opportunity for Japan. And then what we see is Japan's difficulty, unease with China became very evident. So one, what the Japanese did in the Second World War is not liked by the Chinese, right? They captured Manchuria, if you remember Manchurian crisis. And Japanese are remembered as very cruel colonial rulers, very cruel imperial rulers. It's good that the Japanese could not advance beyond Andaman Nicobar and then beyond Nagaland, Manipur. Otherwise, we would have had a very different memory of the Japanese. So then China grew in part due to investments coming from Japan. So there was a hope that China and Japan would be able to turn around their relationship. But by the 1990s, late 1990s, it was clear it is not going to be the case. And Japan realized that a strong China would be detrimental for its security interests. So Japan has been thinking about its security options. And in India, it finds an ideal partner because India has, for its own reasons, a cause to worry about and then respond to China. So this part of the equation, when they look at their regional security concerns, they find China as a common factor, was another driver. So that's why, due to economic factors of complementarity plus strategic factors on the rise of China, what you will find is India and Japan gradually start moving closer. So in the year 2000, 2001, the then Prime Minister Yoshihiro Mori came to India, and India and Japan announced that they would be developing what they called a global partnership for the 21st century. India-Japan Global Partnership for the 21st century. All right? And all these things are there, by the way, in the printed material. So then that is the beginning. And then after that, by 2004, we define our relationship to be a strategic partnership. And then by 2008, we define our relationship to be a strategic and global partnership, 2008, and we start summit meetings. 2014, we define our relationship to be what we call it today, right? Special strategic and global partnership. So you would see in the 21st century, India-Japan partnership has built from strength to strength. It has consolidated, and it has certain fundamental reasons. What are those reasons? Simple. A, traditional cultural civilization linkages. B, economic complementarity. C, a common geostrategic view, which in simple terms, very narrowly defined, is in the context of rise of China. So that has been the trajectory of relationship that we find India and Japan developing. And now it is moving in further direction of consolidation. So let's look at one area of engagement, or we stop here today. This is already 12, and when we meet next, we will simply cover India-Japan relations, mention India-Australia, India-South Korea, FIPIC, Forum for Indo-Pacific Cooperation. And the next relationship that we pick up is with Russia, right? Russia is the next relationship that we will be talking about.